My mother stood across the courtroom, her voice echoing off the high ceilings as she shouted, "It was all mine. Every single cent." My lawyer begged me to step forward and defend myself, but I just sat there, completely silent. Everyone in that courtroom thought I'd lost my mind for letting her walk away with everything my grandfather had spent a lifetime building. But as my mother smiled at her victory, the judge raised his hand, opened a yellowed envelope, and began to read my grandfather's final note out loud. The moment those words echoed through the room, the color drained from my mother's face, and her lawyer's hands started to shake. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The story of how my mother tried to destroy me began the day my grandfather died. My name is Clara Sterling. At 28 years old, I had spent the last 3 years of my life putting everything on hold to care for my grandfather, Thomas, as his health slowly faded. I was the one who managed his medications, cooked his meals, and held his hand during those quiet, heavy nights. My mother, Eleanor, was nowhere to be found during any of it. But the day after Grandpa's funeral, the front door of his house flew open. Eleanor marched into the living room, trailing a high-priced probate attorney behind her like a hired guard. Without a single word of comfort or condolence, she threw a stapled, official-looking document onto the coffee table right in front of me. She looked down her nose at me and said, "Let's not waste time with tears, Clara. The house, the business accounts, the entire estate, it's all mine. Dad made his wishes very clear years ago." I picked up the paper with trembling hands. It was an old copy of a will drafted over 15 years ago, leaving every single asset to her. When I reminded her that Grandpa had explicitly promised I would be taken care of for sacrificing my career to nurse him, she just laughed, a cold, cruel sound. "Promises don't hold up in court, sweetheart," she sneered, offering me a pathetic $5,000 pity check to pack my bags and clear out of the house within 2 weeks. I sat there in silence, staring at the woman who was supposed to be my mother, realizing that the funeral flowers outside weren't even wilted yet, and her war against me had already begun. With 2 weeks to pack up my life, I spent the next few days in Grandpa's old workshop behind the garage. It was the one place on the property my mother had always loathed, a drafty, dust-filled space smelling of sawdust and oil, where Eleanor never set foot. I wasn't looking for treasure. I just wanted to hold on to something that felt like him. But while moving a heavy oak workbench away from the back wall, my foot caught on a floorboard that didn't feel solid. I knelt down, pried up the loose plank, and found an old, heavy iron lockbox hidden in the dark below. Using a small flathead screwdriver from his tool rack, I managed to pop the rusted latch open. I expected to find old family photographs or keepsakes from his youth. Instead, the box was packed tightly with thick financial ledgers, bank transfer slips, and a series of personal journals written in Grandpa's sharp, precise handwriting. As I turned the yellowed pages under the dim workshop bulb, a horrific truth began to take shape. Eleanor hadn't just abandoned Grandpa in his final years. She had systematically tried to ruin him. Nearly a decade ago, my mother had run up massive, secret debts under fraudulent accounts, using Grandpa's good name and business credit. Rather than letting his own daughter face a public scandal and criminal charges, Grandpa had quietly liquidated his personal savings to clear her debts. But these journals revealed something else. That sacrifice had come with a final condition. He had severed all financial ties with her, carefully documenting every penny she had taken. As I held those papers in my trembling hands, I realized Grandpa had been keeping a silent record all along, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. The very next morning, I took the iron lockbox directly to Arthur Vance, the silver-haired attorney who had managed my grandfather's legal affairs for over 30 years. Arthur put on his reading glasses and spent 2 quiet hours carefully reviewing every ledger, bank transfer, and journal entry I had pulled from beneath the floorboards. When he finally set the papers down, he looked up at me with grave eyes. "The document your mother showed you is real, Clara," Arthur explained, leaning across his dark oak desk. "It's an old will from 15 years ago. But what Eleanor doesn't realize, or is actively ignoring, is that your grandfather revoked her power of attorney the moment he cleared her debts. However, The situation was far from simple. That afternoon, Eleanor's high-priced legal team filed an emergency motion in county probate court, attempting to fast-track the execution of that old will. They sent me a formal cease and desist letter, threatening to sue me for unlawful detainer if I didn't vacate the property immediately. Arthur told me candidly that contesting the estate through standard litigation could take years of agonizing court battles, costing money I simply didn't have. Just as despair began to settle back over me, Arthur reached into the bottom of the iron box and pulled out a heavy, off-white envelope we had missed earlier. It was sealed with red wax, stamped with a notary's official seal, and bore my grandfather's distinct handwriting across the front, to be delivered unopened to the presiding judge only during the final probate hearing. Arthur looked at the envelope, then looked at me, a subtle smile touching his lips. "We don't fight her in the press, Clara. We let her push this emergency hearing forward as fast as she wants." The day of the final probate hearing arrived, draped in a cold, overcast gray. Eleanor strolled through the courthouse doors like a queen preparing for her coronation, draped in a designer coat and sporting a triumphant, smug smile. She sat on her side of the aisle, flanked by two sharp-suited attorneys who looked at Arthur Vance and me with quiet condescension. To them, I was just an unemployed, grieving granddaughter attempting to cling to assets that weren't mine. When Judge Harrison took the bench and called the case, Eleanor's lead attorney stood up with theatrical poise. He presented the old 15-year-old will, emphasizing its validity and demanding an immediate, total transfer of all real estate, bank holdings, and business interests directly to Eleanor. Judge Harrison turned his stern gaze toward our table. "Does the defense wish to contest the execution of this instrument?" he asked. Beside me, Arthur leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm, Clara. Let her dig her own grave." Arthur stood up, but instead of offering a heated argument or presenting counter-evidence, he simply stated, "Your Honor, my client does not wish to contest the validity of the document presented by the petitioner." A ripple of quiet shock ran through the gallery. Eleanor practically glowed with arrogance. Unable to contain her excitement, she stood up right there in open court, her voice echoing off the high plaster ceilings. "It was all mine. Every single cent. I told you that old man knew who his real heir was." Her lawyer tried to subtly tug her sleeve to sit her down, but she just laughed, convinced she had completely crushed me. Everyone in that room thought I had surrendered. But as Eleanor celebrated, Arthur stepped forward and held up the wax-sealed, notarized envelope. "However, Your Honor, we are legally bound to submit this final, unopened directive from the deceased." Judge Harrison signaled for the bailiff to bring the sealed envelope to the bench. The heavy silence in the courtroom was suffocating as the judge slid a silver letter opener through the red wax seal. He pulled out two documents, a officially notarized codicil and a letter written in my grandfather's distinct, looping script. As Judge Harrison read the documents silently to himself, the satisfied smirk on my mother's face slowly began to falter. The judge's eyebrows raised, and his stern gaze shifted from the paper directly to Eleanor. "For the record," Judge Harrison announced, his voice echoing through the microphone, "I am reading the final, binding codicil executed by Thomas Sterling 2 years prior to his passing." He cleared his throat and began to read aloud. Grandpa's words were precise, unyielding, and devastating. The note revealed that 2 years ago, Thomas had officially transferred the title of his historic home, his private investments, and all liquid savings into an irrevocable living trust created exclusively for me. The color instantly drained from Eleanor's face. But Grandpa's letter wasn't finished. The note went on to clarify that the estate Eleanor had so aggressively claimed under that old 15-year-old will consisted entirely of something else. Before his death, Grandpa had strategically consolidated all of his remaining corporate liabilities, outstanding vendor debts, and years of unpaid back taxes into the primary estate accounts, the exact same accounts Eleanor had just legally demanded total ownership of. My grandfather had written, "My daughter Eleanor has spent a lifetime demanding everything I own. Today, I grant her full, undivided ownership of the legacy she truly earned." Eleanor's lawyer suddenly froze, his eyes widening in horror as he frantically flipped through his own file, realizing the catastrophic legal trap they had just walked into. A wave of absolute panic swept across my mother's side of the courtroom. Eleanor's lead attorney practically leaped out of his chair, his hands shaking as he addressed the bench. "Your Honor, we request an immediate emergency stay. My client wishes to formally withdraw her petition to execute the primary estate." Judge Harrison's expression remained stone cold. He leaned forward, looking down at Eleanor over his glasses. "Counselor, your client stood up in open court less than 10 minutes ago and demanded absolute, unencumbered ownership of every liability, asset, and account attached to that specific will. You submitted the paperwork, you swore to its validity, and she explicitly claimed it on the record." "You don't understand," Eleanor shrieked, her expensive persona completely shattering into raw hysteria. "He tricked me. That old man ruined me from beyond the grave." "Silence," the judge warned, slamming his gavel down with a sharp, echoing crack that silenced the entire room. By demanding total ownership of the estate under that outdated document, Eleanor had legally bound herself to every single debt attached to it. The judgment was finalized right then and there. She hadn't inherited millions. She had just claimed over $1.5 million in back taxes, unpaid corporate loans, and accrued interest that the state would now come to collect directly from her personal assets. Her lawyer sank back into his seat, burying his face in his hands, fully aware there was no legal escape route left. As Eleanor collapsed into her chair sobbing hysterically, I sat quietly beside Arthur, watching the total ruin of the woman who had tried so mercilessly to destroy me. 6 months have passed since that quiet, decisive afternoon in the courtroom. With the irrevocable living trust fully processed, I was able to secure my grandfather's historic home free of any liens or debts. Using the investment accounts he set aside for my future, I officially launched my own landscape architecture firm, transforming the old workshop into a bright, thriving design studio. Eleanor's reality unfolded exactly as Grandpa had designed. To settle the massive back taxes and corporate liabilities she had legally claimed, she was forced to sell her luxury vehicles, liquidate her investments, and move into a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. She tried calling me several times, but I held my ground, choosing to leave the door to that toxic past firmly closed. Sitting on the porch step where Grandpa and I used to watch the sunset, I finally understood the depth of his final gift. He didn't just protect my financial future, he taught me the true value of quiet resilience, justice, and self-worth. If you were in my shoes, would you have left her with nothing, or would you have offered her a way out?